This move, 1. d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares to develop the queenside pieces, often leading to closed or semi-closed positions where strategic maneuvering and pawn structure play are paramount. This move, nf6, is a flexible and popular response to 1. d4, immediately contesting the center and preparing to develop a knight to its most active square, commonly leading to defenses like the Indian defenses. This move develops a piece towards the center, preparing for kingside castling and maintaining flexibility by not committing to a specific pawn structure yet. This move establishes a solid pawn structure and prepares to develop the bishop to its most active diagonal, aiming for a flexible setup often seen in queen's pawn games. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal and immediately aims to pressure black's knight on f6, potentially leading to a pin or influencing the pawn structure after h6. This pawn break on c5 immediately challenges white's central control and opens lines for black's pieces, aiming to create active counterplay and prevent white from consolidating a comfortable space advantage. This move prepares to develop the king's bishop, solidifying white's central pawn structure and opening lines for queen and rook activity, while maintaining flexibility in the development of the queen's bishop. This move challenges white's central control and directly attacks the b2 pawn, potentially leading to an early queenside initiative for black. White exchanges the bishop for the knight, disrupting black's pawn structure by creating doubled pawns on the f-file and weakening the light squares around black's king. This capture creates an imbalanced pawn structure, weakening black's kingside but opening the g-file for potential piece activity. Developing the knight to d2 supports the e4 push and prepares to castle kingside, while also defending the c4 square, a common target in this queen's Indian-like pawn structure. This capture sacrifices material for initiative, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside. Developing the bishop to a safe square where it supports the kingside and controls the long diagonal is a sensible move after black recaptured the pawn on b2 with their queen. This move recaptures a pawn but opens the c-file for white's rook and weakens black's kingside pawn structure considerably. This recapture on d4 reclaims a pawn, strengthens white's central pawn presence, and prepares for active piece play in the center, aiming to exploit black's weakened kingside pawn structure created by gxf6. This move prepares to expand on the queenside, aiming to create counterplay and potentially attack white's central pawn majority by preparing b5. Castling kingside immediately secures the king and brings the rook into the game, a crucial defensive and offensive maneuver in this complex pawn structure situation. This move brings the queen back into play, reinforcing the central pawn on d4 and preparing for potential pawn advances in the center. By placing the rook on b1, white prepares to challenge black's doubled f-pawns and potentially exploit the semi-open b-file, aiming to regain material or create strong attacking pressure. This move retreats the queen from the active kingside flank, aiming to consolidate after white's recent pressure on the queenside, while keeping an eye on the central d4 pawn and preparing for potential pawn breaks. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses on the kingside and supporting the knight's control of d4. This move prepares to develop the king's rook to an active square, potentially opening the g-file for future kingside attack possibilities. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to support a potential kingside attack and contesting the g-file by indirectly pressuring the defender of the g-pawn. Developing the bishop to e7 improves piece coordination and prepares for kingside castling, reinforcing the king's safety. This move activates the queen to the h3c8 diagonal, threatening the weak black king's defenses while also preparing to support a potential kingside pawn storm or further central pressure. This move challenges white's central knight and prepares to develop the kingside pieces, aiming to contest the open c-file and defend the weakened kingside pawn structure. This move exchanges a knight for a bishop in a position where white has already created structural weaknesses for black's kingside pawn mass, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares and open lines. Opening the b-file after the exchange creates an open line for the rook but weakens the kingside pawn structure, requiring careful defensive coordination. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to exploit the open f-file and create attacking chances against black's uncastled king. This move 15, d5 initiates a central pawn break, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and challenge white's space advantage gained from there. Pawn advances on the kingside. This move bravely seizes central space, opening lines for your pieces and challenging black's pawn structure while preparing to activate your king's bishop. The move forces white's queen to a less active square, regaining some initiative and preparing to contest the open c-file. This move on the d-file prepares to contest the open file and support the central pawn advance, aiming to exploit black's doubled pawns and weakened kingside. This move seeks to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure created by black's earlier pawn grabs and pawn advances by bringing the queen into an aggressive attacking position with immediate checks and potential threats. This move, kh1, is a prudent king safety maneuver to unpin the king from the diagonal and prepare for potential tactical complications arising from black's aggressive central pawn push and the exposed queen. This pawn move aims to restrict white's dark-squared bishop, preventing it from finding a comfortable outpost and potentially preparing for the advance of the queenside pawns. This move initiates a central pawn break, aiming to exploit white's doubled pawns and open lines for their pieces, creating dynamic play in the center. The king repositions to f8, reinforcing the pawn structure and preparing to potentially connect the rooks later in the game. This pawn break on d5 opens lines for your pieces and challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit the doubled c-pawns. This move captures the pawn and opens the d-file for white, but it also creates an isolated d-pawn for black and potentially opens lines towards the black king. The queen repositions to d3, supporting the central pawn push and preparing to potentially shift to the kingside, while keeping an eye on the d5 pawn. This move prepares to double rooks on the g-file, creating pressure against white's weakened kingside pawn structure after the pawn exchange and potentially supporting a future advance of the g-pawn. The rook now supports potential pawn advances on the e-file and eyes the kingside, aiming to join the attack after black's pawn structure has been weakened. This move activates the bishop, aiming to trade it off for white's strong knight on d4, alleviating the pressure on black's weakened kingside pawn structure. The queen returns to h3 to support the pawn advance on f4 and to prepare for potential attacking operations on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the central squares. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's queenside coordination and create dynamic imbalances by potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This move prepares to centralize the rook, offering it more activity and support for potential pawn pushes in the center or on the queenside. The move 24, bc8 is a strategic repositioning, moving the bishop to a safer square on the queenside, indirectly reinforcing the kingside by freeing up the e7 bishop to potentially support the g8 rook, or engage in central play. The move qh4 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, supporting potential kingside attacks and eyeing the dark squares around black's king, while also preparing for further pawn advances or piece development. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key central diagonals and potentially support a later b-flat4 to pressure white's queenside. This move develops the knight to a more active central square, supporting the e4 pawn and preparing to potentially attack the enemy king or reinforce the queenside. The move 26, bf5 actively contests the diagonal, challenging white's piece development and preparing to occupy the strong e4 square. This move opens up the c-file, targeting black's weakened structure and potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside if white can develop initiative there. This pawn move recaptures the piece, but it opens the c-file for white's rook and creates a vulnerable d5 pawn for black, potentially becoming a target in the center. This move repositions the rook to the central file, preparing to contest control and potentially attack the weakened b7 pawn should white manage to open the c-file. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the central pawns and creating potential tactical opportunities against white's uncastled king and vulnerable pawn structure. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to break open the kingside, potentially creating attacking chances by exposing the black king and opening lines for white's pieces, though it does weaken white's own king's safety. This move cleverly exploits the open diagonal towards white's king and centralizes the queen to pressure the weakened pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create threats on the queenside. The queen retreats to h3, preparing to defend the weak pawn on f5 and potentially redeploy to attack on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares to challenge white's control of the c4 square. nd2 aims to reposition the knight, potentially to e4 to attack the c5 pawn and control key central squares, or to f3 to bolster the defense of the kingside. This move offers a tactical exchange that simplifies the position, potentially leading to an endgame where white's king safety might be a concern if black can exploit the open kingside. This exchange simplifies the position by eliminating a knight and centralizing white's remaining knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit black's doubled pawns and exposed king. By exchanging the bishop for a knight, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and reduce their attacking potential, though it does open the f-file for white's rook. This capture on f6 is a tactical exchange that temporarily disrupts white's pawn structure but opens up the e-file for their rook, aiming to exploit black's king and potentially create attacking chances. This move recaptures the knight, simplifying the position and entering a rook and pawn endgame, but it creates doubled pawns on the f-file which could become a weakness later. The rook's centralization on e1 prepares for a potential pawn advance on the kingside or to support a future exchange on the d-file, while also increasing pressure along the open e-file. The rook advances to g5 to participate in the defense of the compromised kingside, potentially eyeing the f5 pawn or preparing to double on the g-file if the opportunity arises. This move activates the bishop, aiming to exploit the weak dark squares on black's kingside and potentially prepare for an attack along the g-file. This move aims to create space for the black king and potentially disrupt white's attacking coordination on the kingside. This check forces black's king to move, allowing white to recapture the important central pawn that was just lost. The move defends the king and prepares to activate the remaining rook on the A file, aiming to challenge white's control of the open files. This move, repositioning the bishop from h5 to h3, prepares to potentially attack the G file or support a future advance on the kingside, while also maintaining pressure on black's king. This move strategically opens the D file and offers an opportunity to create a passed pawn, potentially disrupting white's coordination and creating dynamic play. The rook on d1 is being repositioned to the open D file to challenge black's control and potentially support a pawn advance or pressure down the central file. The move challenges the advanced rook on d1, aiming to exchange material and potentially simplify the position to relieve pressure on black's kingside, while also preparing to reinforce the d4 pawn. The capture on a4 is a tactical error as it allows black to activate their rook on the now open C file with tremendous force, creating significant counterplay. This move creates a passed pawn on the D file, a dangerous potential weapon that black must now try to advance further, forcing white to dedicate resources to its blockade. This move aims to remove the dangerous passed pawn and simplify into a more manageable endgame, where white's active rook can be better utilized. This move is a bold attempt to create counterplay by activating the rook and attacking white's vulnerable queenside pawns, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. This move aims to centralize the queen and defend the crucial e3 pawn, which is currently under attack by black's rook on c2. This move is a tactical desperation, as the pawn is not supported and can be easily captured, but it creates an illusion of a threat. The king is repositioned to safety on g1, moving away from the aggressive queen on d2 and preparing for potential future complications along the G file. This move attempts to create counterplay by bringing the rook to the active third rank, aiming to pressure the weakened kingside and potentially support a breakthrough with the passed D pawn.